Time for another scientific literacy lesson. This is part 2 in a multi-part series about evolution. Last time I gave a short explanation for what evolution is and what evolution isn't, and I said that this time I would cover some of the evidence for our current model of evolution. I have to admit I wasn't looking forward to this lesson because while I'm prepared to talk at length about every one of these topics, nobody would be interested in watching me lecture for the hours that it would take to do evolution justice. As a result, there are 3 problems that can't be avoided. Number 1, in the interest of time, I have to assume a baseline knowledge about things like the age of the Earth, geology, biology, genetics, and I do know that not everybody's on the same page with all that. 2, some of the evidences I'm going to present were reached as conclusions at the end of college level coursework or many people's life's work. I have the audacity to try to summarize these points into 30-second sound bites, so I'm going to miss some stuff. 3, there's absolutely no way this is going to be a comprehensive list. In the 5 years I studied sciences at Penn State, I still didn't come across all the evidences for evolution I'm aware of today, and I'm sure that there's many more that I'm not aware of. In an attempt to address some of these issues up front, I've tried my best to include some real-world examples of the categories of evidences for evolution to make them more accessible. I went out of my way to drop some of the more complicated scientific lingo, where I did my best to explain what it meant as I used it. I've also put all the resource links in the video notes so that you can research for yourself and follow up if you're curious, and I hope that you are. And as far as content goes, to keep the video short enough to be watchable, I'm only going to talk about my 8 favorite evidences for evolution. These are just the 8 categories of evidence that I find most compelling or most interesting. It's far from all of the evidence for evolution. So here goes, my 8 favorite categories of evidence for evolution. Number 1. All life has a universal code and common polymers, which basically means they're made of the same pieces and they speak pretty much the same language at the microscopic level. This becomes especially evident when you start researching DNA and RNA. All life exhibit the same 4 macroscopic or large-scale qualities of reproducing, heritability, or having traits that can be passed to offspring, catalysis, and metabolism. All life exists in nested hierarchies, or groups within groups that branch out and become more diverse. These are all things that we'd predict to find if life had a common ancestor. If there was a single example of any living thing that didn't have all of those things in common, it would call into question all of the premises of evolution, or it would suggest that that thing was an alien that evolved somewhere other than Earth. In several millennia of study and research, there hasn't been one single exception in our catalog of living things that conflicts with these qualities of unity across all life on Earth. 2, the wide variety of fossil evidence for transitional forms. A transitional form is just a fancy way of saying a living thing that is partway between one species or group that exists or existed and a different species or group that exists or existed. Fossilization is an extremely rare event. There's a very particular set of circumstances needed for fossils to form, and once they do, they're desperately fragile. They're destroyed much more often than they're recovered. Luckily for us, life has been around on Earth for a long time, and over a long period of time, even extremely rare events can happen often. Scientists around the world have unearthed and collected hundreds of millions of fossils, possibly even billions of them, for study and for display. Go check out your nearest museum. It's not unusual for larger museums to have upwards of 1 million fossils for display. You may have been told that the fossil record is incomplete. Well, of course it's incomplete. If it were complete, that would mean that every living thing that ever existed had been fossilized. Scientists have been able to identify hundreds of thousands of extinct species that no longer exist on Earth today. Fossil ages have been determined, and they've also had their ages corroborated by estimates based on where the fossil was found. With their ages, it's possible to sort all fossils based on their appearance in the fossil record. If all life had a common and simple ancestor and then diversified over time, what we'd expect to find is older, simpler fossils, and then more complex fossils over time, and eventually modern-looking fossils. When we look at the existing fossil record, we observe a progression over time. The progression moves from very simple to more complex to very modern-looking species over time. We never expected to find as many fossils as we did, and we continue to find more, but of the hundreds of millions of fossils available, all of them tell a story consistent with evolution. 3, the chronological order of intermediate fossils. There are 2 ways to describe the age of a fossil, relative and absolute. Relative dating is when a fossil's age is described based on what it's found in or near. As far as soil layers go, unless there's evidence that layers have been overturned or protruded through, deeper layers are older layers. So the deeper that a fossil is found, the older it probably is. And if it's found in a soil layer or near something that we do know the age of, that fossil is probably about that same age. For many centuries, this was actually the only method we had for dating fossils, and sometimes it was unreliable if soil layers were overturned or protruded through. Absolute dating is a dating method that gives more precise time measurements or time periods, and the most common of those is radiometric dating. Basically, there's a certain amount of radioactive elements that we drink, eat, or inhale all the time while we're alive, but we stop taking those in the instant we die. As time goes on, radioactive elements do what they do. They degrade into other elements. That radioactive decay happens by a very well understood process over a very predictable amount of time. So scientists can take a sample of a fossil, look at the proportion of radioactive elements still present, and that gives them a very accurate estimate of how long the fossil's been dead. Over centuries of study, we've gotten pretty good at dating these fossils, and we grow much more confident in these dating estimates when multiple methods arrive at the same answer. If the theory of evolution were true, we would expect to find the oldest and simplest fossils in the oldest soil levels, and we would expect to find the more modern fossils in the more modern soil layers. If one single time we found a fossil that was chronologically out of place, for example, if even once we found a fossilized saber-toothed tiger next to a fossilized trilobite, that would call into question every premise of evolution. Out of the hundreds of millions of fossils recovered by scientists, guess how many of them were dated to be inconsistent with the evolutionary model? That's right, not one of them, ever. 4. Remnants of past transitional species showing up in modern species. This can happen morphologically or in their body, like whales with leg bones or genetically blind deep sea fish that are born with completely non-functional eyeballs anyway, and examples of this can be found in every living species. This can also happen genetically, like primates, like humans, carry a lot of the same genes that mice and dogs have for scent. But ours are deactivated or dead, so we don't have the same power of smell that they do, but we still have those genes. That means that at some point in our evolutionary history, our ancestors did. If the theory of evolution were true, we would expect to see evidence of change over time. If species change over time, and some species had traits or features that stop being useful, they would stop getting used. If it doesn't hurt the species to still have that little piece or little code hanging around, meaning they can still reproduce, there's no reason for natural selection to select against those individuals. Remember, evolution has no destination. Whatever traits still allow a species to reproduce won't be selected against, even if they aren't useful. So it's possible to see some old obsolete traits show up in modern species. Sometimes the results are not at all intelligent, which brings us to 5. Suboptimality, which means body parts aren't optimized. If the theory of evolution is true, everything alive today is the descendant of a much older, much simpler species. As those simpler forms evolved, in many cases they developed specialized tissues, organs, and features. Sometimes a tissue, organ, or feature could perform a certain function, but over time, the species didn't need to perform that function anymore, but the tissue, organ, or feature could perform another function. When these small changes add up over time, what we'd expect to see is a variety of different forms that perform very similar functions. Think for a second about how many different types of legs or wings or eyes have developed in the animal kingdom, but they all serve the same function. Often in nature we find features that seem unnecessarily complicated, so a much simpler form could have done the same job, maybe even much better. But organisms have to make do with what they're born with. Like the fact that humans' air inlet and food inlet operate through the same hole, which guarantees that not only can we not breathe and swallow at the same time, but a certain number of us are going to choke to death every year. It would make no sense to design a creature this way unless the intent was choking, death, and general inefficiency. Remember, evolution has no goal in mind. As long as the drawbacks aren't bad enough to prevent a species from reproducing, those traits will keep on existing. 6. Biogeography. Or more closely related species have a more predictable distribution around Earth, and so do the fossils of extinct species. When Darwin originally formed his theory of evolution by natural selection, it's no coincidence that he did so after an extended study of the species on the Galapagos. The Galapagos are a chain of volcanic islands off of mainland Ecuador. Volcanic islands are usually young islands. They're formed when volcanoes erupt underneath the surface of the ocean, and the lava, magma, bubbles up to the surface over tens and hundreds of thousands of years. Young volcanic island chains like the Galapagos are very interesting to biologists because very interesting things can happen at these young isolated island chains when plants and animals arrive at them where nothing had lived there before them. So what do we generally find in these young volcanic island chains? Well, in almost every case, what we find are the same varieties of plants or animals that we find on the mainland. And almost every one of those plants or animals are ones that we would expect to be able to make the flight, the swim, or the drift across. In some cases, we do see rapid changes in the populations that arrive at those island chains because these small isolated groups can be affected by genetic drift a lot faster. A really interesting thing happens when scientists track species of insects or lizards or birds or mammals over wide expanses. We observe spectrums. There could be a variety of sizes, of colors, of shapes, of features inside of these spectrums within species. Any two organisms that are found geographically close to each other tend to look very similar, but species that are found geographically separated from one another tend to look more different. At any two consecutive points along that spectrum, two members of the species should be able to interbreed. Being able to interbreed is a hallmark of being part of the same species. When local breeding occurs, local populations tend to look more similar because those genes and traits are being shared more freely. Think of the general appearance of Europeans, the Chinese, West Africans, Native Americans, people from the Middle East, who tend to look more similar to each other than they do from people from other parts of the world. Now, any two humans from any part of the world can still interbreed. We're all still the same species, but our populations were separated for a long time, so they look different. In some cases, there are species we can find a wide spectrum where they can interbreed at any two locations near each other, but at the ends of the spectrums, individuals can't interbreed anymore, which means the two ends of the spectrum are technically separate species, even though across the continuum of the spectrum they can interbreed. If the theory of evolution were true, we'd see evidence of incremental change over time and a dispersal of species that overlaps with that. We've never seen any evidence of kangaroos existing in the Middle East or woolly mammoths existing in Australia. Instead, what we see over and over and over again is more closely related species being geographically closer to one another and more distantly related species having different ranges. 7. Ubiquitous genes. There are some genes that perform very basic functions of life that all living things have. These are our oldest inherited traits from our oldest ancestors. These genes are in no way associated with species-specific adaptations, which means they're probably much older and didn't arise at the same time, and they show up a bunch of times. Here's the best part. Some species don't even need them, but they still have them. There's no explanation for why these genes would be present in every living thing, especially the ones that don't need them or use them, except for evolution. If species arose from previously existing species and then diversified over time, it would make sense that there would be these lingering ubiquitous genes from past species. No explanation outside of common descent makes sense. 8. We've been directly observing evolution and speciation as a result of natural selection for decades. It's always happening, and despite the fact that it's a slow process, we've actually observed new species arise of insects, plants, and animals. We've directly witnessed it happening in fruit flies, firewood, house mice, cichlid fish, cave salamanders, warblers, loris gulls, finches, Croatian lizards. You are a transitional form. Everything alive is a transitional form because everything alive is being acted upon by natural selection, was at one point a member of a different species, and will at one point be the ancestor of a future species. So that's right, you are a transitional form right now. There you have it, my 8 favorite evidences for evolution. There's probably a few familiar ones in there, and I hope there's a few you weren't as familiar with. Again, there's much more evidence for evolution out there than this little list that I put together. So please check out the links that I referenced in the video notes, and I might put together one more video.